What I speak of is the unknowable, of which nothing can be said. All that I say is speculation. In my paper at the 2002 Consciousness Reframed, I suggested that that which we call mind is identical with that physical thing we call brain, and that, like all physical things, it is made of quantum stuff. I then argued that this quantum stuff does not collapse into some classical macrophysical materiality of solid things that we might stub our toes against, but that it remains undetectably in its natural quantum state as a wave function spread across space, entangled in all its possible states at once as one, a multiplicity in its unity. I also consider that what we think of by convention as the mental, as thought, as the immaterial, is not at all so. Mind, that information, memory, thought, and even emotion, which can only ever be our materiality, our brains and bodies, will not merely be constructed of the same kind of quantum stuff as those brains and bodies. It is that very stuff, in its dynamic presence in those aspects of the wave function of the universe that are nearest and dearest to us, that is, are local to us. The mental object and the physical object are, in essence, one and the same thing, simply expressed in two different discourses. The words mind and mental represent how we talk about the states and contents of our brains as these contents accumulate over time, modulating and regulating how we know and understand our experience of the world. Mind is the sign in psychological realms, brain is its equivalent in the physiological. Thus, mind signifies the current state of brain as represented in the transfer functions of all the synapses of the neural nets that are our brains as bodies, and in the biochemistry of all the neuropeptides and hormones, neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that enact our thinking, our being, our remembering, emoting and reflecting upon the world in the dynamics of our time within it. These synapses operate under continual transform as the body-brain goes through its everyday process of being in the world. Subjectivity, those images, sounds and feelings held in the mind as representing something imagined or in the world, is that which is held in the current state of the synapses and the variables attached to those connections in the neural network of the brain. Yet, how do we know the world around us, the universe that contains us, the cosmos that spawned everything from which we become, the all that is our matrix, our support, our sustenance, the source of what we know, but not that which we can know in any way that uses those capabilities that we possess? In answer, I proposed that our experiencing clear and distinct objects in the world is a function of the brain's selection among the possible configurations of the quantum field on the basis of the available probabilities in that field through their application to the configuration of individual synapses in the neural network. These configurations, then, are a function of the proportions of likelihood, the probabilities of the possible states of brain-mind, given the state of the brain's wave function at the time. And it is our being bodies that affords us the means of knowing, of gaining experience, insight into the depth of things surrounding us, this cosmos of which we speak, of which we seek an understanding. How can we know this cosmos? We only have the senses our bodies afford us. We can only know anything by the experience that we have, the wherewithal, the modalities to receive and be affected by the energetic behaviours of the world. But what is that world, that layer behind the veil that is no veil but an absence of perceiving? The source of the illusion is in us. It is not the world that is an illusion, it is our knowledge of it. Suppose that macrophysical manifestation does not occur. suppose that the world always remains in its fully superposed, entangled, non-local condition, and that there is no actualization of real macrophysical objects that we experience from within the framework of a culture based in classical physics. I propose that we leave the mathematical description of the quantum world intact, and all its implications regarding superposition and non-locality will likewise remain intact. But that means that we have to allow that the whole physical world, including conscious brains, do their physical business according to the quantum description. That is, all the sensing, feature extraction, integration and control processing systems of the brain are part of the regular quantum system, just like everything else. What we then have to do is to explain how the objects of the experienced classical world come to be so experienced in human brains. A concept of the brain as a very large, highly structured network of neurons will allow us to do this. This is presumably not all the brain is, but there are enough similarities to make the neural network a useful metaphor for the discussion to follow. In being engaged in some experience, the brain becomes congruent with all the possible conditions that may be available in the wave function of that sensory state. These include the brain's own pre-existing context through which it interprets and understands what it experiences. Thus, if we are observing something that consists in a superposition of two resolvable states, for example particle and wave, with some probability attached to each state, then the brain is in a neural representation of that superposition. It is then a function of these probabilities, weighting the neural networks as to which possible state is selected as the perception that we finally make of the experience. This is not unlike the way we behave in ambiguous social situations, and it is my argument that this is also how we operate in any other experiential processes, where there is more than one possible interpretation of a scenario, from the microphysical to our impressions of the attitude of some significant other. Likewise, when we consider emotions, they also contribute considerable weighting factors, as we well recognise when we talk about the feeling that attends some momentous event, or our feelings about someone. They are very much a bodily process, yet somehow we often think of emotion as not being physical, but being the mental grounds for our ways of understanding things, perhaps because they can appear so irrational. However, we cannot have it both ways. Emotion is a biochemical process that floods the body and the brain with hormones and neuropeptides. They are the chemical behaviours of the body as it acts and is affected by the acts of others. In swamping parts of the brain, they must affect synaptic transfer functions by becoming neuromodulators, just as alcohol does, and thus affect everything that the brain does and every selection that it makes. Your personal configuration of mind is a function of the history of the patterns of connection in its networks that have developed over the duration of your life. Your experience impacts on the synaptic organisation of your brain, which develops an inertia that is your experience. And it is only through experience that you can know anything at all. All this experience is the history and current state of your brain, and therewith your mind. And it is these things that shape your interpretation of all further experience. We cannot experience the quantum layer. We have no means of access. Thus, I can only weave tales of fantasy and wonder, breathing signs and dreams as though they were real, yet no longer manifest, gone before the great wind, cured in the sunlight of understanding, as fresh as the waters of the great ocean. I have always wondered what makes up those rare experiences such as telepathy and intuition, and how they might occur within a framework that supposes that consciousness is an entirely physical matter. Since information is necessarily embodied, the material in which it persists must acquire some shape or pattern which reflects the information content, even if that information is only a collection of bits stored in a computer memory. In us, This pattern is an important factor in the components of the wave functions of our brains. The shape of the wave function of any complex biological entity will be, in varying degree, similar to all other wave functions that represent the current states of other individuals. In any particular moment, the wave function of this state of the brain-mind is superposed with the quantum field that is the world's materiality. It is entirely possible that this might be capable of resonating with the wave functions of other brain minds. If this resonance can be found in another receptive brain, then it might be possible that the two brains could contain the same information. This may result in telepathy. Given that the brain-mind is quantum stuff and is therefore part of the ever-changing wave function of the universe, it is also entangled with all components of the universe, so that any one component is linked by its history to all other components of the cosmos. Now, locality may be thought of as the region over which information about an event can travel while still being perceived as occurring within the timescale of that event. Things can only move so fast, and thus indefinite periods of time can only move so far. Locality is intimately related to the distances over which causal connections can be made. If the distances between two objects are too great, the two objects are non-local. The evidence of entangled, non-local objects shows that when one object of the pair is measured for some characteristic, the other behaves in a way that is consistent only with the two parts being inextricably linked. That is, what happens to one of them must also happen to the other. Their space-like separation cannot confer independence of behaviour upon them. It seems to me that this implies that two entangled wave functions are effectively a single object, even though they may be dispersed over distances that render them non-local. Due to entanglement, non-local brainwave functions may be correlated. If the wave functions of two individual brains become, for some moment, entangled or correlated, for example through a relationship, then they may constitute temporarily one and the same wave function, thus carrying information which, for that moment, is common to both brains. Thus certain forms of telepathy, and also empathy, may involve not an exchange of information, but commonly held information. This form of telepathy is a function of an established entanglement, which would produce a shared mind. The lack of proximity, that is, the non-locality of this combined brainwave function, is of little consequence, because at the quantum level, the two brains are functioning as one. Likewise with empathy. If you get together with some close friend of yours who has just had an emotionally significant event, by no means necessarily negative, and you feel in some way some of the emotion that they feel, this is empathy. It is not merely a sympathy in which you try to show that you feel sad or happy for them, but a state in which you actually experience some level of emotion which for you is similar to that which they are feeling. For example, where you actually shed tears with them in a time of grief. For example, I occasionally find myself actually feeling that I experience things exactly as some other person I know does. It usually lasts but a moment, yet it gives me an insight into not what they are feeling, but how they actually feel. It is as though I have merged with them at the emotional level, or that my emotional structures are, for this short interval, aligned in a way that is resonant with theirs. Another way of thinking about telepathy may involve the action of a kind of resonance, which is a form of sympathetic amplification of a signal. Resonance is a function of wavelength. Let's think of it as a sound in a room or a building. If the sound happens to have a wavelength that is the same as, or an integral multiple of, the distance between the walls of the room, then the reflections off the walls will be in phase with the initial incident wave, and they will sum. Thus the amplitude of a wave, which is harmonic with the size of the room, will be considerably greater than waves which are not harmonic with it. The same applies in the well-known situation of a singer with a wine glass, in which the particular tone vocalized by the singer towards the glass, especially a crystal glass, may build up enough strength to shatter it. We also speak of an artwork having a spectrum of resonances across various fields of meaning. But what do we mean by this usage? How can artworks have resonances? The answer, of course, is that the meanings that seem to be embedded in the artwork, as revealed through our reading of it, bring out references to meanings in other phenomenal experiences or artworks that seem to relate by some sort of congruence, common usage or similarity discerned while considering the significances embodied within the object. In the quantum world, we surmise that everything is made up of waves in the quantum field, and thus everything has some kind of characteristic wavelength, which is consonant with its wave function, such that the wave function constitutes an object. Of course, this wave function will be astonishingly complex, but there is no reason why resonances may not occur. In a complex system, for example, a brain in a sufficiently receptive condition, the possibility of resonance develops. It would probably be more a function of some components of the wave function of that brain than the whole of it, when any of these components may be able to resonate with components of another brain wave function in other regions of the field, just possibly permitting two of these wave functions to carry the same characteristics and perhaps carry the same information for some short interval. This could also be telepathy. Note again, there is no transfer or exchange of information between these two systems. It is simply that, for however short a moment, they are in very similar states, so that they may thereby embody very similar information patterns, which may resonate in such a way as to allow some amplification of the information in a brain, bringing it to notice. A further phenomenon that we might consider here is intuition, which comes to us from below conscious thinking, sneaks up and very modestly announces itself, thus being so easy to ignore and, in my experience, so dangerous so to do. It may be that the wave function of the brain momentarily resonates with some sign that we have missed and amplifies it to just above the threshold of consciousness, providing us with a solution or a warning or some other knowledge that we wouldn't otherwise have noticed. In all of these phenomena, the perception or recognition of the event requires that one be in a sufficiently receptive condition, which for telepathy might mean that meditation, and particularly those forms of meditation that attempt to empty the mind, the shell, of everything that functions as an attachment, would be a way to achieve such a state of being receptive to the finest of influences. For empathy, and for that fleeting moment of intuition, it is openness that is required. And finally, where do these wave functions, these quantum energy fields reside? In what are we embedded? For me, it can only be in the void, at that smallest of all possible scales, the Planck scale of 10 to the minus 35 meters, where the quantum vacuum seethes, and some suggest that 0-point energy offers an infinite potential. And this must be the way. Its form is the Tao, and its current, its energy, will be Qi. Do we ride on Qi, the undivided source of which all things are made? Is it this which has been understood through that deepest philosophical penetration of the ancient Taoists? For they say that the Tao, the great way, is the void, the undivided source of all, single and still. As the void began its motion, its changes, a primal energy grew. From this, through its division into the yin and yang, its breaking of its own symmetry, in its desire to know itself, its complementary forces, it spontaneously generates the universe. In the poetics of knowledge, it is an epistemology of the unknowable, an ontology of non-being, wind whispering in the leaves, the murmur of the twilight expressed in the roar of the void, the quietness of a hurricane, the thundering brightness of the dawn, and the dance of the dragon named Aurora Borealis. If it is anything at all, the Tao is the void, the matrix from which all things are born. If it is anything at all, Qi is the seething energy of the vacuum, the spawning of the seeds from which all matters grow.